Many communities have an urban forester. We don't have as many here in this part of the world, but many larger communities do have urban foresters, and they might have the title urban forester, community forester, municipal arborist, city forester, a tree warden, municipal tree officer. Many of our communities in this part of the world where we have mid-size or smaller communities might have somebody within the community that has multiple responsibilities, and part of those responsibilities might be caring for the municipal forest or community forest. As an urban forester, you're going to be interacting with a lot of other professionals and groups in order to get your goals and objectives for management completed. Public works officials, urban planners, civil engineers. Let me see if I can get my pointer working here. There we go. Civil engineers, government agencies, and the general public. These are the 5 that ISA calls out in the book, but I added a few others because I didn't think that list was complete. Contractors, arborists, and nurseries would definitely be another group that the urban forester is interfacing with, along with nonprofits, community groups, tree boards, any other organization that's similar to that, and then Parks and Rec staff or department as well. We know that trees provide many benefits, both direct and indirect. And in general, they can be classified into 4 broad categories: environmental improvements, aesthetic enhancements, economic savings, and social health and well-being. And we'll dive into each of these a little bit more in depth. It's also important to remember that urban forests have, they incur economic and ecosystem services or costs. Sometimes we call these disbenefits or disservices. There's kind of a whole new area of study into disservices of urban forest as well. But it's important that we take into account the costs as we think about benefits, so we have the true net benefit accurately figured out. So the costs and management that could be considered would be establishment, periodic maintenance, and removal. So those are the broad categories of management costs. The important thing to remember here is that although our urban forests are assets, when they're not properly cared for and managed, they become liabilities. So this is something that we want to avoid as much as possible with good proactive management. So looking at some of the tree benefits, we'll dive into environmental benefits first. I thought it would be fun as we went through this to put our burly bur oak, a 16-inch into the National Tree Benefit Calculator, so we could actually put some numbers to the things we're talking about. If you've never used the National Tree Benefit Calculator, it's a really simple online tool. It asks for your location information and the species and the size of the diameter of the tree, and then it will calculate benefits for you. So this is a really simple way if you're trying to communicate to somebody, maybe you're a master gardener or in the public educator in the public, this is a great tool to have. And I lost my pointer again. There we go. Okay. So trees can improve air quality, and they do this by collecting and filtering airborne particulate pollutants and holding them on their leaves. So this is, one of the main things we think about with tree and air. But the other thing we think about is just the fact that they are shading some of our paved surfaces and helping reduce evaporative hydrocarbon emissions as well. So I put this, our bur oak into the tree benefit calculator, and you can see all the different particulates here and how much value in quantity that it is helping absorb or deferring in that calculator. Okay, so we also have trees sequestering carbon. Trees take up carbon from CO2 in the atmosphere and they store it in the form of wood or carbon-based tissues. Diana asks, where do we find the calculator? You can just Google National Tree Benefit Calculator.
Yeah, I'll post a link in the chat.
That'd be great, thanks. Sorry, I'm gonna reduce it so I don't see you all. I have too much going on my screen, you guys. I had to get rid of your faces. Okay. So they're sequestering carbon, storing it in their tissues. And the thing to remember is that as trees, when they die and as they're decomposing, they're also going to release that carbon back up into the atmosphere. But here, you know, our 16-inch bur oak reduced atmospheric carbon by 880 pounds. So they were able to quantify that measurement. Okay, so we also think about trees reducing stormwater runoff and erosion. So stormwater runoff and erosion, if you think about, you know, our heavy rainfalls or even light rainfalls, the water or stormwater or rainwater runoff, if you want to, whatever term you want to use, is hitting the ground and then running usually into our gray infrastructure that helps prevent flooding and erosion and other, it just provides stormwater control to our communities. Where trees come into play is that trees help slow that stormwater. So you have precipitation that's gonna hit the tree leaves and structure of the tree. Some of it's gonna sit on the leaves and be, it's gonna evaporate off back into the atmosphere. Some of it is gonna follow the stems of the tree, the trunk of the tree, and end up infiltrating into the soil. And then some of the water or rainfall is just gonna, you know, fall through that canopy of the tree. No matter what, probably the most important part of our trees in our urban canopy is that they're just slowing the velocity of water that is entering our storm system. So here's an example. Our 16-inch bur oak will intercept 1,600 gallons of stormwater runoff this year. That's a pretty big function for our communities if you think about the thousands of trees that are in each of our communities. Okay, trees also conserve energy. They do this from multiple different ways. We think of shading probably first and foremost. We all benefit from it, but when you have properly placed trees on the shading the east and west sides of your house, you're gonna help reduce the sun radiation that's hitting it, and it's gonna be cooler and using less energy. You can also have windbreaks or other forms that are blocking wind, be it cold winter winds or hot summer winds. And you can also design your trees that they're gonna make sure that the radiation from the sun can hit the house or any building in the winter months. So you can get some heat and you can use less energy actually warming your house. So here you can see in this tree benefit calculator, we have 239 kilowatt hours of electricity for cooling and reduced consumption of oil and natural gas. So again, a huge benefit in this situation. So, you know, I threw this picture up because I think we've all felt this on a really hot summer day here in Nebraska. You know, the pavement is absorbing the radiation of the sun, and man, is it hot. And we all gravitate to those tree-lined streets that are just a lot cooler to be on. But this really has a significance, this open, sun-exposed pavement and hard surfaces for our entire community, particularly in the urban heat island. And this is a phenomena that happens within our built environments. So we have buildings, asphalt, and concrete that are absorbing solar radiation. And then they emit long wave radiation that heats up the atmosphere. So in this particular image, because we probably all aren't thinking in Celsius every day, you can see the difference here in this urban center is 91 degrees Fahrenheit compared to about 86 degrees here in the park. So again, our vegetation plays a huge role of cooling our built communities. Okay, other tree benefits we think about are the economic benefits of trees. And we've seen this a little bit as we've been putting things into the tree benefit calculator, but there are some specific benefits that we think in more of an economic sense. Of course, there's reduced cooling expenses, but there's things like increased property values. So, properties that have trees on them tend to sell for a higher value. Increased sales tax. Oops, I have tax in there twice. Increased sales tax revenue. So people who enjoy shopping in shady business districts, they stay there longer, they spend more money, you end up with more sales tax. And then we have the reduced replacement and maintenance costs of pavement. So we have the trees that are shading the pavement, they're protecting the pavements and other hardscape surfaces from degrading effects of the sun. And thereby they reduce the replacement and maintenance costs over time. And then we think of the tree health benefits associated with social aspects such as health and wellness. So there's lots of wonderful research out there on social benefits. I'm going to highlight the ones that ISA has highlighted. So things like shorter hospital recovery times. So people with a view of nature were found to have shorter hospital recovery times and use less pain medication. There's been correlated nature or natural settings have been correlated with behavior improvements in children. There's reduction of some types of crime, and there's reduced stress. Of course, there's been lots of other studies that have been done over the years that reinforce the social value of our natural spaces and our urban tree canopy. For many in the general public, we probably aren't thinking day to day about things like air quality or air temperature or things like that. So for most of the public, the thing that they enjoy and is driving them are the aesthetics and beauty of our green spaces. And if you stop and think about it, our green spaces, our green infrastructure is really the connective tissue of a lot of our communities. Without, if you just imagine and closed your eyes for a minute and thought, oh, I'm driving to the community and I'm erasing in my mind every single tree, every single shrub, garden, things like that, pretty soon it's pretty drab, it's really hot, there's a lot of different types of architecture going on. But when we add back in all of that plant material, there really is a general aesthetic attribute that is appreciated by everybody. Okay, so we're going to move into valuation and appraisal. In other words, like, how do we quantify all of these benefits? How do we assign value to a tree? So the first valuation method is called the CLTA methodology. And we're just going to touch on this with one slide because I will say that this is an entire certification in itself. But it is a methodology that's created and promoted by the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers. And it's really more for an individual tree or a small group of trees, but it's looking at things like tree size, species, location, and condition. And it takes all of that into account to assign a value to that tree. But when we look at the broader forest, our entire community forest, we need some other methods for assigning a value. And some of the steps needed to quantify ecosystem services and values. So we need to quantify the forest structural attributes, and we'll get into that later in the section about tree inventories. Quantify how the structure influences ecosystem services. We have to quantify the impact of the ecosystem service. What does this service provide to society? We've touched on some of that already. And quantify the economic value of impact provided by the ecosystem service. So some of these things have been done through research. And if you look at this list, you can see some of the things like avoided emissions. We've been able to quantify them and assign a value to them. Some things we still don't or are unable to quantify, or we're unable to assign a value to. And there continues to be new research out, and tools continue to be updated to reflect it. But it is important that not every benefit is yet quantifiable, or are we able to put a value to it. So if your head is spinning about how exactly you're going to go through and find all this information and do all these calculations and try to figure out what your community forest is worth or what values it's providing, you should be. That's a lot for us to figure out. And thankfully, we have some tools that have been developed to help us. So the most common tool that is used is iTree. And iTree was designed, it was a public-private partnership, and it was designed to accurately assess local vegetation and compositions and structure, and its impacts on numerous ecosystem services and values. If you're interested in learning more about iTree, I did put a link in this slide that goes to a 16-minute video that's kind of an intro to iTree. And it's pretty good. It gives you an overview, but iTree is free. You can download it onto your computer. There's some modules that are available just to do online, but there's quite a few different tools within iTree that help us quantify and assign value to our urban canopy. And we're going to circle back around to this a little bit later in the presentation as well. Okay, so we're going to move into planning. So one of the things I want to call out as we go along is if you see a yellow box, that is ISA's definition. And usually the definitions show up in testing. So one of the things to consider is that urban forests are part of green infrastructure. And green infrastructure is strategically planned and managed network of natural resources. This can include our trees, our wilderness, urban streams, conservation easements, parks, greenways, and working plants. And all of these natural resources work together to support native species. They maintain the natural ecological processes, sustain air and water resources, and they contribute to the health and quality of life in our community. It's important to note that the value of our natural resources and well-maintained natural resources appreciates as time goes on. You can simply think about this as a young tree that you just planted opposed to your nice, beautiful, mature trees in the neighborhood, and the quantity of benefits they can provide. Gray infrastructure depreciates as soon as it's built. So our gray infrastructure is things like our streets and our water systems and our electric systems and all the things that we need to be able to survive in our modern day life. And all of that will depreciate as soon as it's built. As we think about our network of natural spaces and our urban forest, it is important to think about sustainability. And sustainability is the ability to maintain ecological, social, and economic benefits over time. You know, when we're in urban forestry, we're in it for the long game. So if you think about a beautiful mature street you've been on with mature tree canopy, somebody before you was making decisions about those trees and what they wanted the urban forest to be like 60, 70, 80, 100 years into the future. So it is our job as urban foresters to be thinking about maintaining sustainability. We want to make sure that our trees are reaching functional maturity. And we're wanting to make sure that the trees that are mature are being retained and maintained within our communities to try to maximize the tree benefits. Okay, so it's pretty hard to think about sustainability and tree benefits and tree values if we have no idea what's in our forest. And this is where tree inventories come into play. So a tree inventory is a record of the tree of location, characteristics, assessment of individual trees and tree stands over a well-defined area, such as streets or parks. And hey, Graham, I closed the chat box, so if somebody has a question, just interrupt me at any point.
You bet I will.
Okay. So why do we need a tree inventory? First of all, we want to be better managers of the tree resource, right? It's hard to manage if you don't know what you have. We might want to locate management or trees for management work. Where are they? If you get a call that says that, hey, my tree has a branch that came down or something like that, you need to be able to locate it. You're going to understand the structure of the urban forest. So your species, age, and condition. You have to know species, age, and condition to be able to get the values and tree benefit values that we talked about earlier. You might want to assess your canopy cover. Are there areas of your community that are missing canopy? Is it equitably distributed throughout your community? You might want to identify vacant planting spaces. Where can we plant for the future? What are we not considering? What was a planting space that shouldn't be a planting space? You're going to need a tree inventory to be able to do any kind of management plan, planting plan, or any other plans. And we're going to get into plans in a little bit. Your tree inventories are going to drive budgets. How many trees do you have to care for, and what is the cost going to be? And it can help with emergency preparedness, knowing where things are in your community, to be able to interface and work effectively with other departments within your municipality to make sure that we are obtaining safety for the residents. And then documenting. If there's things that you need to document, a tree inventory is a place that you can do that. So once we have the data from the tree inventories, it can be used to assess the structure, function, and value of the urban forest. So if you think about the structure, that is what we talked about in the one slide ago, which was the species, age, and condition. So I just have some examples of what I pulled out from a actual tree inventory that a community did, but you can see here, you can learn things like what are the most common species in your community? What are the different sizes? This is the table that actually, had the different DBH ranges and combined with the species. So there's a lot of things you can know. This is really important because this is telling you as a urban forester, what types of goals and management strategies and things like that might you need to put in place in order to make sure your community forest is resilient for the future. The other thing tree inventories can give you once you have that structural information is it can actually give you the value. And so this is where we're going to circle back around to iTree. Many of our programs now have iTree built right into them. So once we have all of our data, you could either put it into iTree, or you can, use a software program that already has it built in, but it's going to give you the monetary benefit of our urban forest. And this can be used to talk to people who make decisions, whether it be policymakers, other types of decision makers, the general community who is voting and deciding where their tax dollars are going to go. This is really important information to have. When we understand the benefits, be it environmental, economic, or social, of our forests, we can make better management and design decisions that can maximize the human health and our environmental benefits now and into the future. There's several ways that you can do inventories. The most common nowadays is using some kind of GPS device, and then using some kind of program that's GIS, or Geographic Information System based, which helps digitize maps. It's not the only way you can do it. There's inventories that are paper as well, but this is pretty typical to nowadays.
Christina, there was one comment from Mariana that's
Yeah.
great. That's great right here. Having an inventory, if you have a community full of ash trees, the inventory helps you know where they are for planning for planting down
Yes,
the road and all
absolutely.
the yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that you can go about doing inventory. One is random sampling. This is going to give you a large scale picture of your forest, but not provide information on each tree. It's not going to cover every single tree. But if you're trying to get a snapshot, just get a general sense of like where you are, that might be an option. You can do partial tree inventories. Partial tree inventories collect information for defined neighborhoods or business districts, park systems, things like that. They can also be used sometimes in a community, especially larger communities, or maybe you're having to use volunteers to do your community, and it's just not possible to do an entire community inventory in 1 year. Sometimes partial tree inventories are used, and you might have part of your community done like every 5 years, and you might rotate around. You also do complete tree inventories. These provide the most information, but they're also the most expensive to conduct and maintain. So things that are collected when you're out doing an inventory. Also, I'll just say, there's endless information that you could collect when you do an inventory. But the more data you collect, usually the slower it is and the more expensive the inventory becomes. But the typical things that you're going to have on a tree inventory are going to be your tree species, your diameter, the location of the tree, the condition of the tree or condition code, which is what ISA uses, maintenance or maintenance code, that's what ISA uses, and notes. You can certainly have more information beyond that. You could have things like the canopy width, or trying to think if there, you could have down to cultivars if you wanted. There's lots of different information, but these are pretty standard to most tree inventories. Okay, so tree inventories can also help and interface with regulatory and legal issues, and that's what we're going to move into next. So the first thing to remember is that because municipalities have a duty to keep residents and visitors safe, and they bear certain responsibilities and obligation associated with city-owned trees, they will have liability they may, I should say, have liability in the event of failure that causes damage or harm. So as we talked about earlier, as an urban forester, you're maximizing benefit, but you're also managing risk. And this is where a risk management plan comes into play. So the plan should include risk management policy statements and policies for identifying, assessing, reporting, and mitigating risks from hazardous trees. Other components of the plan, they might include, but they're probably not limited to, a standard of care statement, maybe a determination of acceptable risk. For example, is it okay to have a little bit of risk if it's a park and there's not going to be someplace, a target if that tree fell? The frequency and methods of tree risk assessment. There might be record keeping protocols the community has, and a statement of how the program is to be funded. The other component to regulatory and legal issues for a community is tree ordinances. And tree ordinances are legal regulations drafted and instituted to protect trees with a given jurisdiction. Hopefully, the municipal arborist or urban forester is involved with drafting and reviewing tree ordinances. We want to make sure that the best practices and the best standards are used when they're created. The things that a tree ordinance should define are going to be the jurisdiction's authority. They should describe the conditions and requirements of the ordinance. They need to establish penalties for noncompliance. What happens if somebody does not follow the ordinance? Who's going to make sure that the ordinance is being enforced? So types of tree ordinances you might find in your community could be who's in charge of right-of-way tree care. What are the guidelines and requirements for obtaining permits? Do you need permits? Authorization for public works to enter private property. What if there's some kind of tree complaint? Can the public works official go onto the property to look? It might list acceptable species to be planted on a jurisdiction's property. This is where our street tree lists come into play. And there might be regulations for things like topping of trees. So we avoid the picture on the left with what's happening management wise with our community trees. Tree ordinances also might end up requiring permits. So hopefully your tree ordinance is defining them, but types of permits that sometimes are required are things like planting, pruning, and tree maintenance. Another common permitting is tree services that might need a license to operate within that jurisdiction. The tree ordinance hopefully is giving the urban forester or municipal arborist the authority to review and approve all the tree related permits to ensure that the protection and best care of the trees is involved. The other thing that you might find in a community is a tree preservation order, which is a TPO. It's not as typical in this part of the country, but it certainly is as you head out to the East Coast or even over in Europe, you see that a lot. But it's a legal regulation, and it's established by the local authority that protects a tree or multiple trees. So what this is doing is trying to protect a tree from development. If there's development happening, so the tree is not removed, or it might protect a tree that's in an area that's already developed from being removed. So it's protecting that mature canopy or historical trees. Okay, a few other parts to regulatory and legal issues. So to know about, the first is a standard. So it's an established or widely recognized authority of acceptable performance. And in tree care, it's the American National Standards Institute, ANSI A300, that are standards for tree care operations. And they're designed to be used for writing specifications. And specifications are detailed plans, requirements, and statements of particular procedures and or standards used to define and guide. I'm sure all of you can think of particular specifications that you've had to either implement being a contractor, or you've had to write being in the municipal side. But these could cover things like planting, pruning, fertilizing, monitoring, support and protection systems, the construction near trees, removal, And it's important to remember that they should apply to both contracted and internal work, both. So we're trying to make sure that we are applying the same high level of care across our entire community forestry system. Okay, so we are going to move into management. So management is of the urban forest. The point of it is to maximize benefits and manage associated risks and costs. I'm going to see how many times I can say that through the entire presentation. But again, we want these big mature trees, as in this picture, but there are risks associated with it. And we have to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to keep the trees healthy and to keep people and structures safe. If you have a tree inventory, if you have your tree ordinances, you're able to start to put a management plan together. Urban forest management plan is a really critical component to our communities. It helps provide continuity. It gets everybody on the same page. It's a communications tool. But also, if you think about people involved in community forestry, they're coming and going. And our community forests are something that's really long-term. So an urban forest management plan is that tool to help kind of bridge the gaps when people are leaving, when situations change, and it makes sure that we're ultimately continuing to perpetuate a resilient community forest. So things in urban forest management plan will include strategies and procedures, goals and objectives. A goal and objective could be something like, maybe you have a canopy goal. You want to increase your canopy by 5% in the next 5 years. And your objective would be how you're going to actually get that done. You establish guidelines. You're going to include key stakeholders in it. It's not going to be something that's done in a vacuum. You're going to consider the limitations and constraints. Every community has limitations and constraints, whether it's financial, political, whatever it might be. There are things that you have to consider when you're doing management plans. You're going to consider your resources. Every community has resources. It might be your people, your knowledge, other natural resources, things of that nature, but you have to consider those and incorporate them into your plan. And then you're going to evaluate your plan, and you're going to do that hopefully, every 5 or 10 years. You're going to go back and look at it and make sure it still makes sense. So you might have an overall management plan, and then you might have some sub-plans as well. The sub-plans could be things like planting plans, preservation plans, maintenance plans, tree removal and replacement, could be operations. It might be an emergency or storm response plan. And the one that I think a lot of people are thinking about right now is emerald ash borer. Like so that planning, what are we going to do to manage emerald ash borer? I will say that plans are super important, and it tends to be something that we all avoid. And this is my personal opinion, but plans are critically important to a long-term resilient forest. Okay, so one of the things we think about in management or urban forest management is tree diversity. So what does the overall structure of that forest look like? And what are the species that are making it up? So on the image on the left, you see a beautiful tree-lined street lined with American elm. And then you see the street after Dutch elm has gone through. And for urban foresters, we're trying to manage and mitigate catastrophic events. We don't want this type of situation to happen. And so when we have our tree inventory, we have our regulations, we have our management plan, we can really start to implement some tree diversity plans into our community to mitigate this, to make it so we don't end up in this situation again. So things you might be thinking about are species diversity, 30% family, 20% genus, and 10% single species is kind of the rule of thumb. And this is what the ISA guide uses. But to be thinking about, that in your community, it could change depending on the area of the country you're in. As you go into tropical zones, a lot more species to be able to work with. As you go into maybe desert or really arid zones, there might be less. So it's not always achievable, but it's something to be mindful of in planning. Species diversity is certainly not the only kind of diversity. We also want age diversity. I could just get just as nervous about driving into a community where I see big, beautiful old trees and I don't see trees of any other age. Because what is the succession there? What's going to replace them when they die? And then size diversity as well. Making sure that we have big canopy trees, but there might also be other sizes of trees within our communities. Okay, the other important component to urban forest management is the actual tree maintenance. And this has to be done on a broader scale because now we're managing the entire forest resource. It's not just an individual tree in a yard. So we're thinking about things like how do we sustain our tree benefits? How do we minimize our risks? And how do we be proactive? So proactive pruning is one of those ways we do that. Usually 4 to 5 years is the ideal pruning cycle. I think if you talk to a lot of municipalities for various reasons, they might be extended out past that. You are going to be monitoring for potential hazards, and you're going to be monitoring for tree health problems. When it comes to tree maintenance, deferring maintenance can lead to higher costs and risks and is likely to reduce the benefits of trees. So risk management is tied directly to tree maintenance and removal. So proactive pruning and other maintenance can reduce emergency calls and the potential for damage or injuries from tree failures. So we start to be proactive about our community forest. We can mitigate a lot of those big expenses and terrible tragedies on the back end. Okay, so the other part of management that we're thinking about as community foresters is wood waste. This is something that typically, if you think about our removals, our pruning, there's constant wood waste that is coming out of managing the community forest. This wood waste doesn't go to the landfill, so we need other things to do with it, whether it be firewood, wood chipping that the public is using. I have this picture here. Graham gave me this picture of just a milled log from an urban tree that will probably go to be used as a desk or some other furniture making in the future. And the other thing that happens with wood waste is that we compost it. I called out this definition because ISA has it in the guide, but composting is the process of decomposition of organic matter by microorganisms. Most likely that will be on your test. Okay, so we're going to move into a couple other components that they had in this chapter. One was wildlife. So it's important to remember that the urban forest is part of an ecosystem and that many birds, insects, and other wildlife depend on it. It's a complex system. It has living organisms and their abiotic environment. And it's affected to some degree by every measure taken within and around the urban forest. So you can think of things as we've been learning over time, how critically important some of our tree species are to pollinators, how many of our songbird birds have come to, I guess, rely on some of our urban forests and the benefits that those trees provide to them in terms of habitat. It's also important to know as an urban forester that there might be legislation and regulation that impact our work. So you think of things like when you can actually be up in trees and doing removals or pruning because of nesting seasons. So it's just something as urban foresters to be aware of, that we aren't doing urban forestry work kind of in this vacuum, that it is part of this complex system, and that it's our job to be aware of all the components of it and how our actions are impacting it. So the last part of urban forestry is just communication and the public outreach. So as an urban forester, you should be able to communicate everything we've just talked about, the needs and benefits of trees, the values of trees, quantified, because that's how many of our decision makers are making decisions. You need to convey the needs of trees. You need to be able to tell an engineer like, hey, you know what, this tree needs X amount of rooting space or X amount of space for the canopy. And you're gonna have to tell the public as well about the needs of trees. You should be able to communicate well and in the language of all of these different entities. So you need to be able to take what you know, and you need to learn enough about all of these other components as well, that you can adequately communicate the needs and benefits of the urban forest. And then you need to rely on groups as well, such as tree boards and other tree advocate organizations to help spread the message of the urban forest out to the community. I would say, you know, urban forestry, we always think about the trees, but it's just as much about the people as well, because we are dealing with managing the habitat that humans live in. And so people are very much a part of the picture that the urban foresters are going to have to communicate with on a timely and consistent basis. So with that, I think we've covered everything in the chapter. And I think we have maybe some chapter questions that Graham had. I'm going to try to get up the chat and everything back up here.
Yeah, great job. Nothing in the chat really, but we could certainly take some questions here for a little bit while we get those questions up to go over if we want to do that. And if you have questions about any of the material we've covered so far, that's fine too. It doesn't have to be chapter 14 specific. Christina can speak to a lot of other topics than just this one. So if we don't have any particular questions on 14, because it is kind of a niche,
Yeah.
you know, anything that you got on your mind is fine with the time that we have left. So I love all the benefits that you mentioned, and I talked about some of those a little bit too, that are maybe not on everybody's radar as much. The hospital stays, the crime prevention, those are things that aren't necessarily in the forefront of people's minds when they think of tree benefits, but really,
Yeah, absolutely.
They all kind of add up to just so much benefit that if you look at any one benefit, maybe it seems negligible or not worth it, but you add on and on and on and on to, you know, dozens of different things that trees are doing in our community, and it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Do folks want to go through the test questions?
Yeah, we did get a question from Kent about the pros and cons of different types of tree inventory applications.
Yeah.
Just to give a quick initial thought, there are, you know, iTree itself is not an inventory software. It analyzes inventory data that gets put into it, but there are probably a dozen different software out there that can be used, and I'm sure they have some different pros and cons as far as their usability, but probably most of them are pretty comparable. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, Graham, I think, yeah, that's a good clarification for people that iTree itself is not where you're collecting your data. It's just the model for analyzing it. Yeah, there's quite a few software tools out there. They all have different costs. And I think really it just depends on what your goals are for your own program. If it's something where you're like, hey, I'm actually going to use this inventory software for management in real time. That might be a completely different need than a community that's like, well, I'm just going to go out and do like every 5 years, I'm going to do a tree inventory. But there's lots of options out there, and we're happy to help anybody think through potential options as well. So you can just reach out to us.
Yeah, the other thing I'll throw out there is that some of the tools are more reliant on internet connectivity than others.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a more remote location or a rural community where reliable internet service, isn't there all the time, then there might be some software that's a better choice because you can sort of check out the satellite imagery that you're going to use instead of relying on having that signal all the time. So that's one thing that can vary between them.
Yeah.
We did have another question from Laura, and Kent, feel free to elaborate if there's something specific about those different software. Christina and I don't have experience with all of them, but we could speak to some of that maybe. Laura asks, when did you switch from measuring caliper to DBH? So caliper is a nursery standard where they're measuring right at the base of the tree. And they do that because it's wider at the base and they want a bigger number to to price the trees by, maybe. There may be other practical reasons for caliper, but caliper isn't as useful for our purposes as DBH, where the trunk has a more uniform thickness to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, what it comes down to.
Yeah. And DBH stands for diameter at breast height, which is considered, I think, 4.5 feet off the ground.
Right.
It depends on how tall you are. It's probably not.
Yeah.
For me, it's probably shoulder height.
Yeah, it's not the most specific term.
Yeah.
Breast height can vary, but yeah, about 4.5 feet is the general rule. Kent says, do you have a list of the more common inventory applications that I could reference and research?
Absolutely, Kent. We can send you some things.
Yeah. Tree plotter, tree works, arbor gold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gosh, there's
that
probably at
covers
least half a
repair
dozen.
covers a lot of them, but
yeah. Doug mentioned from West Point, they've been using tree plotter, and he mentions that your cell phone can be a hot spot for connectivity, and that's huge. True. If you have a phone that can broadcast Wi-Fi to a tablet and your phone is getting decent service, then you've kind of solved that issue that way. And we have heard people that's worked really well for. Mariana was on a webinar last fall where they promoted the idea of measuring lower than DBH, more like a foot above the base. Yeah, I mean, you're probably going to get a very similar measurement. If there was a reason to change the industry standard, I'd be interested to hear it. Otherwise, it sounds like you're going to get pretty much the same measurement that way. Yeah, Kent's looking into different software applications, and City of Omaha has one as well through a company called Beehive that's down in Nebraska City. And I think that's an extension of the software they use for all their other infrastructure. So that's great when you can have your tree data right in there with all the other layers of your sewers and power lines and things. It becomes real powerful. City of Shadron's using tree plotter right now, and it's working great. That's great to hear, Scott. We were part of a pilot program trying another software called Urban Forest Metrics. And it was taking that check-in, check-out application for imagery to make it more accessible for rural communities. And it had some strengths and weaknesses. it was a little bit more complicated of a process,
Yeah.
but it did circumvent that connectivity issue that some people have. City of Lincoln uses Beehive as well, it sounds like. So Kent, maybe you could reach out to Michael or any of the folks at City of Omaha about their experience with that one, at least.
Does I guess I'm just curious. I don't know who all is on the call here. Do people know if their communities have a community forestry management plan?
There's always a little bit of a delay if people are in the chat responding.
I'm watching the chat.
Yeah. So while we're waiting to see if anybody chimes in there, we're working on a EAB preparedness plan template. It's more specific than a management plan for the whole urban forest. And anybody that was willing to go do a trial run of that in the next couple of weeks, we're trying to get some input from other communities on how that goes so that we can modify and improve it a little bit before we release it statewide. So if that sounds really interesting and you're ready to go through that in the next coming weeks so that we can get your feedback and integrate that feedback into the final product, certainly, get a hold of me or Chrissy or chime in the chat and we'll follow up with you. Yeah, I'm not seeing,
Field data
yeah.
entry instrument. Yeah, Laura,
instruments.
I think that really depends on what your software is that you're using, quite honestly. And then also, what you have available to you for your community. We use iPads a lot, but there can be other drawbacks, as Graham talked about. There's some software systems that you need to have internet connectivity and to tree plotter.
Yeah. So I've got this iPad mini. It works pretty nice. It's got a case that has kind of like your hand can slide in here. So I'm not going to drop it very easily. The nice thing about something this size is the screen's big enough that you can navigate those drop down windows well, but it's not so big that it's going to drain the battery quickly. If you don't have a phone that can be a Wi-Fi hotspot, then you're going to want to buy a tablet that is able to have its own service plan, just like a cell phone would. So that's a little bit of more cost to get, a tablet that's set up that way instead of just something that can take a Wi-Fi signal. But that does make it a little bit more all-in-one instead of having multiple devices to keep charged and that sort of thing. Doug uses an iPad. Yeah, as long as you can use pretty much any tablet that it has a big enough screen for you to see everything well enough. And occasionally you might have to, plug it into the car to charge it while you go. If you're going at it for a whole day, that's been my experience. And that's going to be based on how big the screen is. But you typically need the brightness on the screen turned way up in order to see outside when there's glare from the sun and all that. Yeah. So that puts a drain on the battery.
So I did just put in the chat a link to YouTube video. US Forest Service just has a series out. There's 4 videos. They're kind of cartoon based. They're really good on urban tree monitoring. So if you are working with volunteers or trying to think through things, types of data you might be wanting to collect, this series kind of walks you through the basics of all of it and is a really great introduction. So and I think they even go into things like, how do you exactly measure a tree? How do you measure a tree if it has 2 stems or 2 trunks as opposed to 1? But it's a great series. I think each video is about 6 to 7 minutes. So that link is there.
Nice. The other thing to mention on inventories, I guess, is that we've been doing inventories long before we had all these fancy devices, right? And so you can get kind of a snapshot of the community with more of just a a tally,
Mhm.
right? Where you have a sheet of paper that's got rows for different species and then columns for different size classes. And you drive through the community and you're just making tick marks in the appropriate column to kind of track that. So it doesn't tell you where each tree is or what condition they're in, but if you just want a sense of what diversity is like and for species and age, we've been doing it that way, you know, in this country for decades. So
Mhm.
that has some value too, and a lot less challenges on the front end to getting the whole thing going.
The other thing I would say, which we didn't, ISA doesn't really get into in the chapter, is that if you're just really wanting a quick snapshot for your community, let's say you want some basic ecosystem services, you're kind of curious what your tree canopy looks like, you can use a tool like iTree Canopy that goes in and it actually evaluates. I mean, it takes a little while to do it, but it actually takes you through a sampling process where it uses Google Earth and you identify whether that dot is on a tree or not on a tree. And that gives you some basic information about canopy cover. There's some basic eco benefits that are associated or it'll give you results for. It's different than a tree inventory. It's just a canopy assessment, but it is still a good starting spot if you're trying to figure out where to start.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of interest in this, and we may need to put together
Yeah,
a training of some sort on tree inventory basics or something along those lines. So
yeah, it sounds good.
you don't necessarily have to weigh in the chat if you're interested in that, but we might send a follow-up email to everybody from the workshops here to see if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Mariana had a comment from the Iowa Shade Tree short course. People are looking into whether you need to hire professionals or whether volunteers can do some of that. I'm guessing it's kind of a mixed bag, Mariana. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, they found that if you're using volunteers, certain amounts of data work out fine, but then as you get more complex, estimating like what is a tree species sometimes gets a little more muddy. Other times, they found the costs are about the same. As a professional, you get more up-to-date information.
Right.
Or more accurate information, but the costs are the same because there's still money involved in working with volunteers and things. You've got to provide them materials and maybe even water bottles and donuts and stuff. But then on the other hand, you get community buy-in if you're using volunteers. But the costs are about the same, and you get a little more accuracy from the professionals, but there's different benefits from using either one.
Hey, Graham, Mary's audio was really, really quiet. So maybe you could just summarize what she said.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was just on my end or if everybody else was having trouble. So
I think it was my headset I was using.
Oh, yeah. So with volunteers, or go ahead and if you wanted to repeat that, Mariana, you could.
And with using professionals, you do get more accurate information. It depends on also the level of professionals that you're using. And then volunteers are accurate at certain measurements. It starts getting busy when you're using.
Right. So when you have volunteers doing data collection, then you're really the issue is how good is their tree ID. But as Mariana pointed out, you get more community buy-in and interest in the project than if you just pay contractors to come in and do the data collection maybe more accurately, but it's kind of not on everybody's radar and they're not as engaged. There's an argument to be made for the genus level being as far as we need to go with inventories in most cases. But it's a lot easier for someone to know they're looking at a maple, for example, than is it red maple, silver maple, sugar maple. But from an insect and disease and management standpoint, it probably makes little difference between those species. There's exceptions to that, of course. So yeah, there are definitely some trade-offs. Thanks for mentioning that, Mariana. And then Kent, a little further on the inventories, regional statewide infrared aerial photography. So I think that technology is still in its infancy, and we're definitely still not at the point of identifying species from the air yet, but it's coming.
Mhm.
Anything you want to add to that at all?
No, I mean, I'm curious. I know that there's technology out there, and I will say that we're probably way behind in Nebraska or this region, but that's okay. I think we'll keep learning more, and I think it'll be, great to be able to have some of those tools for canopy assessment.
Yeah. You mentioned iTree Canopy, and that's a great tool where you can at least identify how much tree canopy you have as a percentage. It won't tell you what kind of trees they all are, but it takes you through a process where you randomly look at locations around the community that it provides you, and then you tell it whether that's a tree right there or not, and it sort of calibrates to calculate your canopy cover percentage for all that imagery. So it's great for establishing goals for adding canopy cover and confirming whether you're meeting those goals or not.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get to the species level like Kent was asking about.
No, it is a fairly quick way though to get a sense of where you're at. It might take 3 to 4 hours. I mean, if it's a small community, it would take a lot less time. But for example, I just did with students, we did a canopy assessment of Kearney. And so it took a couple hours to get 1,000 points. Of course, the more points you do on an assessment like that, the more accurate it is. But it's a pretty small time investment to get a good snapshot of maybe where you're at, as you try to decide where you're going to invest into tree inventories and such.
Yeah, but overall, just a real powerful management tool that's helpful for municipalities to know what they have and where it is and what condition it's in, the same way you would for your streets and everything else. The other thing that we have seen, we're helping Central Community College in Hastings with an inventory, and they are going to actually do drone imagery so that the pictures that they're looking at from the sky are very up to date and it's reflecting exactly what's on the ground right now. Otherwise, you're relying on imagery that might be a year or two old in some cases, depending on how recently new imagery's been taken from the sky. So the drone thing is coming into arboriculture now as well, not only for that sort of imagery application, but also for assessing tree canopies and getting access into the tree without taking the time and labor to physically get yourself up there. So with drones, you can actually program a route for the trees to go around a group of trees, and you can repeat that same route over and over again so that you're looking at the exact same, video tour, if you will, throughout time. So Kent has done some drone imagery of county campuses. Regular aerial photos are done with leaf off conditions. Yeah. They both have their pros and cons there.
Would anyone want to see in the back side of tree plotter? I have it open, and I'm happy to throw it up on a screen if people want to see the back side. All right.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say this is our Tree Plotter University account that I use with the students. So there's only one data set in here, and it's a CTAP and inventory from 10 years ago. So it doesn't have nearly the amount of data that you probably have in a typical inventory. But this is kind of what the backside of tree plotter looks like. You can see, you know, all of your species are on the right side here. All that data has been collected now, so that you aren't looking at the collection view, you're looking at once it's in the system. But it's really nice because once you are in it, you can go through and do lots of reports and dashboards. So, you know, tree plotter will give you tons of different reports. It all depends on the data that you have available to make them work. But you can see here, you know, you can do trees by your DBH percentages. You can do it as a bar, you can do it as tabular form. So you can do this with a lot of different components of your inventory. You know, you can see here we have missing data, right? It's just that dieback wasn't something that was recorded in this inventory. You're going to have lots of stats. So you can look at your organization or your inventory kind of by the number. And so you can go through and pick stats for any particular species, genus you want. If there's maintenance issues, you can go by condition, land use, growing space. I know some communities that are typically the residents care for their right-of-way trees, but the community itself only cares for the park trees. But this is a great opportunity to inventory potentially everything, even the components that that are on public property, but the resident might care for, and then you could separate that out by land use to look at. There's lots of charts and graphs that you can use. So here's an example. There's tree health. I think I showed this one earlier. You can have year planted if that's something that you track. So you can go through, there's a lot of stuff, tree health, tree diversity, management needs, location. All of these have a lot of different subsets of graphs and tables. And then the great thing about it is that iTree Streets, iTree Ecos built in. So you get your ecosystem benefits. You can also do a lot of reporting. So you could come up with, just looking here, so dashboard charts. You could run a report that's going to be more in a printable form. And you can go through and you can edit it. So if you need to add in additional information. So just a lot of different tools. You can set it up however you need it for your community. It's pretty simple to use, I feel like, pretty self-explanatory. I'm not a tree plotter expert in any way, but I thought it would be fun to show people the back end of tree plotter. Any other questions people might have? Okay, as I said earlier, you know, we breezed through a whole bunch of topics that could literally be an entire course or entire presentations on each of them. If you're interested more in some things, if you're interested in tree ordinances, contact, you know, Graham or Chrissy. We recently had Paul Reese that did a presentation on tree ordinances. So if that's something your community is wanting to improve, we're happy to provide you with that particular presentation. If you're interested in management plans, you know, you can reach out to me, Graham, Chrissy. We'd be happy to work with you on things like that. So any way we can support you, we'd like to do that.
So if you have CEU information, go ahead and get that in the chat so we can get you credit. Thanks, Justin, getting right on it. NAA, ISA numbers, all that, per usual. And we got a few minutes left and glad to just kind of chat about whatever, tree related or not, I guess. The inventory stuff is interesting though, and it is, you know, laborious. It takes a lot of time to collect all that data. But once you have that base layer that you just have to, you know, change as you take trees out and plant new trees, then you've got most of the work behind you, and it's just kind of making a living document out of it.
Mhm.
Most software is also going to be able to integrate with your work order system as well, so that you don't have that extra step of updating the inventory as you send your crews to go deadwood prune tree 524. As that work order comes back in, then the history gets saved with that tree and updated automatically. So it works really slick. Just that front, that big project on the front end.
Mhm.
Let's see. Anything else, guys? It's a beautiful day. It wouldn't be a big deal to wrap up a little early. Here's a comment from Deanna. Yeah, I'm a data nerd too, Deanna, so I love putting it to use. Valuable on number of levels. Yeah, Deanna mentioned earlier about using iTree reports for grant applications.
Mhm.
I'm sure that makes a real powerful case for whatever you're trying to accomplish. So good idea there. Any of those software will probably also allow you to split your community up into smaller areas if you wanted to set goals for specific neighborhoods.
Mhm.
Not every part of town is going to have the same challenges, right? So in Deanna's neck of the woods where she does a lot of work, got a lot of good canopy already. So the focus there might be more on how you take the best care of all the big trees that are there already while still chipping away at the planting as she does. Other communities, especially in more suburban areas that are newer, the identifying those tree planting locations so that you can get to work on filling them is potentially a bigger priority. So it's not the same community wide always. Sounds good.
I thought I'd maybe just expand on that. DBH, this webinar, they talked about, it was about measuring trees and what do you do when you have multi-stem trees, which is one reason for lowering it. But the original forester, whose name I forgot many years ago, who set the standard of DBH at 4 feet, he said, oh, you know, Europe, this is what the standard for Europe. And they said, he was lying. He said there was no standard. He was very tall. So 4 feet was very convenient for him. So he set that as the standard and everybody followed.
Yeah, yeah. And it's always good to be accurate with standards, right? And DBH is, you know, it's not a specific height, but you know, it is a nice acronym. Once people get those 3 letters in their head, DBH, it's hard to switch to something else. That's good background, Mariana. Thank you. Okay. Well, I've got all the usual suspects as far as CEUs go. So yeah, I suppose go enjoy the sun. Get outside today. And we'll see you guys next week with Rob Dean on Tuesday and Thursday to wrap up the workshop series. And we'll see you all then. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, everyone.